Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria. Now, a week ago, I published a video talking about how I would propose for the army of Winterfell, or the army assembled at Winterfell, to fight the army of the dead and win and successfully manage to defeat the army of the dead. And needless to say, the show completely didn't take any of my advice, of course, which I knew it wouldn't, and did lots of things wrong. I'm going to come back to that in a second, and did completely different set of things to what I advised in that video. Spoiler warning, spoiler warning. Okay, before I carry on, if you haven't seen episode 3 of season 8 of Game of Thrones and you don't want to be spoiled, don't watch on. Now, actually, I've been thinking about this, and since I did that video and in the last week, since the episode aired, I've seen lots of people all over the internet going, Matt, they should have taken your advice and they did everything wrong and it was a complete disaster. Well, was it? Let's think about this. So I'm now looking at this in a completely different way, and I was wrong. What I advised to do was wrong. What they actually did ultimately was correct and won that battle, because it defeated the Night King. And there are actually very few ways that they could achieve that goal. So let's have a breakdown, and instead of all of the things that they did wrong, which other people have been making videos about, I'm going to list all the things that they did right. So first up, I'm actually going to give my kind of conclusion at the beginning of this video and say that the ultimate goal was to defeat the Night King. Okay, they realized that they couldn't defeat the army of the dead, and those are the two headlines. They could not defeat the army of the dead because of the way the army of the dead is created, and the way it's basically indestructible within certain bounds, within the weapons at their disposal, shall we say. Despite the fact that they had dragons, despite the fact they had dragon glass weapons, ultimately they realised that they couldn't defeat the army of the dead. But there was one chance. It's a little bit like Avengers Endgame here. There was one chance in a million, and that one chance was to defeat the Night King. So everything I'm about to say has to be set within that context. So let's break down the points that are commonly listed as criticisms of things they did wrong in the battle or siege. It wasn't really a siege, it was more of a battle. So the first thing is that they didn't use or make enough use of archers. Well, first of all, I would argue, based on what we saw from the episode, they simply didn't have enough archers. Bear in mind that the Dothraki, for example, whereas in the books they have a lot of horse archers, we barely see any horse archers in the Dothraki in the TV series, so we have to assume that the Dothraki don't have any they have negligible number of archers. In terms of the archers available to them within Winterfell, made up of the various forces involved, it seems like they didn't have that many archers. Moreover, it seems like whilst they had lots of dragon glass, they didn't have access to lots of bows and arrows. You can't simply make bows and arrows like that. They're actually relatively complex objects to make. You have to have the right type of wood. It takes time to be worked. Same thing with arrows. You can't just get twigs off trees and make arrows. You have to process the arrow shafts and the fletchings and everything else, and it takes time. It takes a large amount of time, in fact. So based on what we saw in the episode, they simply didn't have enough archers to deploy massed archery. That wasn't an option that was available to them. The next massive criticism aimed at this episode was that they put the army outside of the castle. They've got a castle. In conventional warfare, if you've got a castle, you put your forces inside, and it's a force multiplier, and it's very difficult for an army without siege engines, but even an army with siege engines, to take a castle. And medieval history is full of examples of castles holding out for months or even years in some cases. But in this case, that simply wasn't an option because the army was too huge. They had already elected to fight with this number of soldiers. They had roughly around 100,000 combatants on their side, and they couldn't fit within Winterfell. Another major criticism is that there weren't enough people up on the walls. Well, again, as far as they know, the Night King is riding around with a flame-breathing dragon, and they're not really preparing to have a siege. They don't seem to have a great amount of faith in the castle to actually resist the army of the dead. Instead, they're pinning their hopes on drawing out the Night King outside in open battle so they can take him out. And I'll come back to that point in a minute. Next up, and connected to that, we have to say that the walls weren't very effective. There are two main reasons for that. First of all, the experience from Hardhome had shown them that fortified positions, walls and gates and things like this can be overrun by the Whites, by the army of the dead. And moreover, they also know that the Night King has a blue fire-breathing, wall-melting dragon that has destroyed a magical wall that has stood for 1,000 or more years. And so the walls of Winterfell are not going to be able to resist that. So there are two major component parts of their enemy: the Whites, the actual army of the dead, who can overrun walls, and the dragon that can melt walls. So there is no point putting loads of people on walls and trying to defend the walls when the walls aren't capable of defending. I would go even further and say that actually bunching them together on walls which are potentially going to be collapsed or melted, would mean that you'd simply lose even more people even more quickly by bunching them together high up in the air, where they're likely to be more concentrated as a target for dragonfire, but equally they're more likely to come off the wall and die simply from falling. In addition to this, I had in my previous video, and lots of other people in their videos and comments on forums and such like, have said that they should have withstood a siege, essentially, to sort of hole themselves up and just withstand the army of the dead. You can't do that. It's the army of the dead. They're not going to starve. You are. We already know from things that Daenerys has said that they don't have enough food really to feed an army of 100,000 people. And not only that, but they can't really fit the army in the castle. So you can't fit the army in the castle. You can't feed the army in the castle or water them. And moreover, we have just established that the castle itself can't even withstand the siege anyway. So there's no point bunching the people together in the castle. You may as well put them outside the castle, which is exactly what they did. There are two other things that are important to consider within a wider context of warfare as well. In normal siege warfare, you often hold yourselves up and hold in the castle so that your allies can come and relieve you. That is the whole point of staying in your castle, is so that you can outlast the army outside the castle. That is never ever going to be an option against the army of the dead. They can outlast you. Moreover, in this specific case, there are no allies coming. So why would you stay in a castle and get yourself surrounded so that you can't flee from it when there is no chance, there is no hope of being rescued or relieved in that castle. So there's no point holding yourselves up in the castle. But additionally, some people have said, oh, well, they should have just fled. Well, we've got to, within the context of the story, also accept that this is something they've decided not to do. They've decided to make a stand to try and take out the Night King. And again, I will come back to that point more strongly in a second, because just to reiterate, that is the major goal here. They have realised the only way to defeat the enemy army is to kill the Night King at any cost. So they've decided to stand their ground, and by using the castle as a backing, as a backdrop, what they essentially do is they sort of secure one side of their army. So actually it was a great idea to take this massive army, which can't put itself in a castle and withstand a siege anyway, to put the army outside where it can actually fit and fight and not be bunched together as a small target. And additionally, it's more likely to draw out the Night King, and having the castle behind has secured their rear from potentially losing even more of their army from being surrounded, which is a very real threat against the army of the dead, which is vast in number and ever multiplying because of people being risen from the dead. Now, there were 2 points which I struggled to justify that people have criticised a lot. The first one is the use of their siege engines, mostly trebuchets, outside of the castle rather than having them inside the castle and being able to fire their fiery projectiles for longer without being overrun by the army of the dead and by the Whites primarily. Now, there is something to think about there. So based on prior experience, Jon's experience, for example, at Hardhome and the other wildlings who were there, They know that the army of the dead moves very quickly. It's very quick across the ground, which incidentally is another reason why fleeing may not have been an option, because they may have known that an army of, well, just a mass of that number of people, that population in that area, could not have fled fast enough to get away. They had to make a stand and fight. But by putting the trebuchets outside, they achieved something very important. They moved their weapons, their firing weapons, closer to the enemy army. Now, that's important because bear in mind that what they're trying to do is do as much damage on the enemy before the enemy get into close combat with them. That is, try and thin out their numbers slightly so that when you do eventually get into hand-to-hand combat with them, there are fewer of them, hopefully. So by putting the trebuchets forward and knowing, for any of you who don't know, a trebuchet takes minutes, many minutes to load. I would say even slower to load than something like a cannon, for example. So you simply, with a fast moving opponent, be it cavalry or be it running zombies, which they're facing, you don't have time to reload. So one, perhaps at maximum 2 volleys of firing flaming projectiles from your trebuchets is the most that you're going to get. So knowing that that's the case, you may as well put them forward, knowing that those projectiles aren't going to have the time to reload and fire. And bear in mind, once the whites are in close combat with your army, you can't shoot projectiles into them anyway without killing your own troops. So you may as well put the trebuchets way out forward so that you can engage the enemy as soon as possible. Okay, so put the trebuchets out forward. As soon as you know they're there, lob some fiery projectiles at them and then get the hell out of Dodge. Just abandon the trebuchets. So actually, that's defendable from that point. The second point, which initially I struggled to justify, was the charge, the suicide, kamikaze, banzai charge almost, of the Dothraki with their flaming swords. Well, first of all, we have to sort of assume that the flaming swords, they didn't know that they were going to have flaming swords. That seems to, you know, the Red Woman comes along, Melisandre, and she does her thing and makes the fiery swords. Okay, that's great. That makes them slightly more potent. But why? Why do a suicidal charge into the enemy when you can't even really see the enemy? Well, we could say that maybe they could see the enemy and it's just us viewers with that strangely dark finish they put on the episode of The Long Night. But anyway, let's assume that they couldn't see them and they charge in and they presumably killed some number of the army of the dead before almost all, I wouldn't say all being destroyed because obviously some of them fled back, but basically being wiped out more or less. Now, there is one reason why what they did might make sense. And I would probably agree with the people who say they would have been better used in skirmishing if they'd actually been horse archers with obsidian or dragonglass arrows, riding around and around. They can ride much faster than the army of the dead can move, riding around and around and peppering them with arrows at range, and then every time any zombies come towards them, riding away and peppering them with more arrows. Yes, that would have been a good plan. But you're all missing one very important thing. You cannot defeat the army of the dead with the weapons that they have at hand. You're just not going to be able to kill all of the army of the dead. Okay, that is not an option. There is only one, we come back to Avengers Endgame, there is only one way to win against Thanos, sorry, I mean against the Night King, and that is to kill the Night King. Okay, you could progressively kill all of the White Walkers and then kill the Night King, but ultimately the only way to win this battle is to kill the Night King. So why does the cavalry charge out and engage the army of the dead? There's an obvious reason staring you in the face. What they're doing with their courage is trying to save the lives of the main army. Okay, the main army's back outside Winterfell. The Dothraki charge to engage the army of the dead so that the Night King will reveal himself. That is what it's all about. That's why Dany and Jon are up on the hillside watching the battle, watching the charge, because they're waiting. They are essentially the cavalry in this scenario. They're the airborne cavalry. And they're off to the side, quietly watching with their dragons, waiting for the Night King to reveal himself so that they can mount their dragons, gang up on him, kill him, and then what would those Dothraki have achieved? With their courageousness and their loyalty to their queen, they would have saved the lives of everyone else who wouldn't have had to have fought back closer to Winterfell. Because, as I've said many, many times now already, the only way to defeat the army of the dead is to kill the Night King. So what that Dothraki charge was all about was trying to out the Night King so Dany and Jon, who didn't know that the snowstorm would come, would go and attack him, kill him, end a battle, pure victory. It didn't work out like that, but as we all know, most strategies don't survive first contact with the enemy. So to conclude, actually, I think they did everything right. They had to put the army that they had, which didn't involve a lot of archers, they had to put the army they had outside of Winterfell for all the reasons I've mentioned. It was a good idea to put the Trebuchets forward and engage the enemy and do as much damage as possible with your one shot as early as possible. So in other words, put them out in front and then abandon them. It was the right thing for the Dothraki to charge. It was a gamble. It didn't pay off, but it was a gamble that was worth trying to try and reveal the Night King so that they could do a checkmate on the Night King and wipe him out, right, without having to risk any of the rest of the combatants. And I just keep having to reiterate that the whole point of this was to reveal the Night King. Now, there is one final point, which I don't know if any of you noticed, but Bran, okay, let's mention Bran here for a second. So Bran was the honeypot, wasn't he? He was the trap to try and lure the Night King in. He was the next way of trying to lure the Night King so that they could kill the Night King. Bearing in mind, the only way to win this battle was to kill the Night King. And who was he surrounded by? Archers. Okay, Bran was surrounded by archers, and that comes back incredibly importantly to one of my earliest points, the fact that yes, archers with dragonglass arrows would have been very effective against all those zombies, although it wouldn't have won the battle ultimately, not without killing the Night King as well. But who did they surround Bran with? They surrounded him with archers because their end goal was to get the Night King into a vulnerable position where they could kill him. Now, Arya, okay, who did eventually kill the Night King, that was not planned, okay, but what they were aiming to do was to get the Night King into that garden, essentially, around the tree, so that they could pepper him with probably dragonglass arrows and kill him that way, which would have been a fine plan. It didn't work out in the end, unfortunately. Again, you know, you can have a good plan and it might not work. That doesn't mean it was a bad plan. It just means that your good plan unfortunately didn't work this time. And luckily Arya came to the rescue and she finished it off. Ultimately their plan was not as flawed as many people have worked out. It was a long series of ways to try and get the Night King to reveal himself so they could kill the Night King, and that would win the battle. And you know what? They succeeded. They won the battle at heavy cost. But I would argue that if they had done things in any of the other ways that I have seen people suggesting online, they would not have won the battle at all. So, in defense of Winterfell, the Long Night, I think, was a tactical success. And of course it was. It's unarguable that it was a success because, of course, it resulted in victory. Thanks for watching. And give us a like if you thought this was interesting. Subscribe if you hadn't done already. And I'll see you again soon for another video. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.